in the heart of the city, at a party glittering with the kind of wealth most of us only dream. Of one family reigned supreme the Blackwoods. They had everything money power and a cruel sense of entitlement. That night, they set their sights on a humble waitress, deciding she was their sport. They pushed her, ridiculed her, and tried to break her spirit in front of a room full of the city's elite. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They never imagined she had a secret, and they never ever thought she would walk up to the stage, grab the microphone, and unleash a truth that would bring their entire empire crashing down. The Serafina Club wasn't just a restaurant, it was a testament to old money, a fortress of quiet opulence perched 28 floors above the bustling city. Its windows were vast panes of crystal that muted the sounds of the world below, turning the sprawling metropolis into a silent, glittering carpet for its patrons. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white lilies and expensive perfume, a fragrance that clung to the velvet chairs and starched linen tablecloths. For the staff, it was a place of meticulous rules and invisible servitude. For the guests, it was a playground. Tonight, the club's main ballroom was reserved for a private event, hosted by the Blackwood family. Even among the Serafina's usual clientele of billionaires and titans of industry, the Blackwood name carried a unique weight. They weren't just rich, they were an institution. Richard Blackwood was a titan of finance, a man whose whispers could shake the stock market. His wife, Eleanor, was the city's reigning social queen, a woman sculpted from ice and ambition whose approval could make or break a person's social standing. Their son, Julian, was the heir apparent, blessed with his father's sharp looks, and his mother's cruel streak, wrapped in a package of Ivy League arrogance. The event was ostensibly to celebrate Julian's engagement to Isabella de la Cruz, a beautiful young woman from a respectable but significantly less wealthy family. But everyone in the room knew the party's true purpose: to announce the finalization of a multi-billion-dollar merger between Blackwood Capital and a Korean tech conglomerate represented tonight by the stern-faced Mr. and Mrs. Lee. This deal was the crown jewel of Richard's career. Among the black-clad staff, moving like silent phantoms through the room, was Alara Vance. At 24, she had a quiet grace that didn't quite belong in the frantic, high-stress world of hospitality. Her large, expressive eyes held a depth that hinted at a life lived far beyond the confines of serving champagne and canapés. She worked at the Serafina Club, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Every dollar she earned went towards the crushing medical bills for her mother, Maria, who was slowly being consumed by a degenerative neurological disease in a modest nursing home across town. Ilara's true passion, the thing that fueled her soul, was music. Her voice was her only inheritance from her mother, a soaring soprano that could fill a concert hall. But dreams of Juilliard and the grand stages of the world had been shelved indefinitely. Life had demanded a different kind of performance from her, the role of the smiling, deferential waitress. Vance Table 7 needs more champagne. Blackwood Table, barked Mr. Davies, the club's manager. He was a stern, older man with a perpetually worried expression, but he had a soft spot for Ilara. He was the one who'd hired her, seeing a flicker of something familiar in her determined gaze. And be careful. Mrs. Blackwood has already complained that the flowers are drooping. Yes, Mr. Davies, Ilara said, her voice a soft murmur. She retrieved a chilled bottle of Dom Perignon, the condensation cold against her fingers. As she approached the Blackwood table, a bubble of anxiety tightened in her chest. The family was seated at the center of the room, a royal court holding session. Eleanor Blackwood, draped in diamonds that glittered like shards of ice, watched Ilara's approach with an unnervingly critical eye. "Finally," she said, her voice carrying across the table loud enough for those nearby to hear. One would think they were sourcing the grapes themselves. Julian chuckled a smug, unpleasant sound. He leaned back in his chair, deliberately stretching his legs into the aisle. "Mother, you have to be patient. Good help is so terribly hard to find these days. They aren't exactly poaching them from the Ritz." Ilara's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression perfectly neutral, a mask of professional courtesy she had perfected over years of similar encounters. She murmured, "My apologies for the delay, ma'am," and began to pour. As she leaned over to fill Richard Blackwood's glass, her hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Richard himself was a study in controlled power. He was handsome, in a severe way, his silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed. Unlike his wife and son, he was quiet, his eyes fixed on his Korean guests, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, with whom he was engaged in polite but intense conversation. He didn't seem to notice Ilara at all. He was a planet, and she was a speck of dust in his orbit, utterly insignificant. When she reached Julian's fiancé, she noticed the young woman's strained smile. Isabella's eyes, a warm hazel, met Ilara's for a fleeting second, and in them Ilara saw not arrogance, but a deep, weary sadness. Isabella gave a tiny, almost apologetic nod, as if to distance herself from the family's boorishness. "Careful there," Julian snapped, as Ilara moved to pour for him. "This suit is Tom Ford. It costs more than your yearly salary. I'd rather you didn't redecorate it." "Of course, sir," Ilara whispered, her voice tight. She poured the champagne with painstaking precision, her entire focus on keeping her hand steady. But as she straightened up, Julian, with a casual, almost lazy movement, shifted in his chair. The leg of his chair caught her ankle. It wasn't an aggressive trip, but it was just enough to unbalance her. Ilara stumbled, and the heavy bottle slipped from her grasp. It didn't smash. Instead, it landed on the plush carpet with a dull thud, sending a fountain of expensive champagne splashing across the pristine white tablecloth, and to Ilara's horror, onto the sleeve of Eleanor Blackwood's silk dress. The table fell silent. The conversations at nearby tables faltered. Every eye in the vicinity turned towards the scene. Eleanor Blackwood looked down at the dark, spreading stain on her sleeve, as if she'd been struck by a physical blow. She rose slowly, her face a mask of cold fury. "You clumsy, incompetent little girl," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Do you have any idea what this dress is worth? This is haute couture. It's irreplaceable." I am so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. It was an accident." Ilara stammered, her heart pounding against her ribs. She fumbled for a napkin, trying to blot the stain, but Eleanor slapped her hand away. "Don't touch me," she screeched, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. The entire ballroom was now watching. "Get her away from me. Richard, do something. This is humiliating." Julian leaned back, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying the show. "See, Mother. This is what happens when you let just anyone wander in off the street." Richard Blackwood finally turned his attention from the Lees, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. The interruption was jeopardizing the delicate rapport he was building. He didn't look at Ilara. He looked past her at Mr. Davies, who was now rushing towards the table. "Davies!" Richard boomed, his voice radiating authority. "Control your staff. We are trying to conduct business here. I expect this mess to be dealt with, and I expect her wages to be docked to pay for the damages." Mr. Davies arrived, his face pale. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood. It will be handled immediately." He grabbed Ilara's arm, his grip surprisingly gentle but firm. "Come with me, Miss Vance." As he led her away from the table, a wave of shame and anger washed over Ilara. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the injustice. Julian had tripped her, she was sure of it. But in this world, the truth didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was power, and she had none. From across the room she could hear Eleanor's voice, still ringing with theatrical indignation. Honestly, the quality of people these days. No grace. No breeding. One wonders where they even come from. The words struck Alara with an unexpected force. Where they come from. She clutched the small silver locket she always wore tucked beneath her uniform. It had been her mother's. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of her mother, Maria, young and radiant, and on the other side, a picture of a man Alara had never met her father. A man her mother only ever referred to as Rick, a struggling musician with a poet's soul, whom she had loved fiercely before he disappeared from their lives, chasing a dream of a different kind. "Just breathe, Alara," Mr. Davies said softly, as they reached the sanctuary of the staff corridor. "Don't let them get to you. They're vipers." "He tripped me, Mr. Davies," she whispered, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Julian Blackwood. He did it on purpose." Mr. Davies sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know. I saw it. But what can we do? It's their world, Alara. We just work in it." He looked at her, his expression pained. "Take a few minutes. Compose yourself. I'll smooth things over." But as Alara stood in the sterile white corridor, the muffled sounds of the party filtering through the walls, something inside her began to shift. For years she had swallowed her pride, endured the snide remarks and the casual cruelty, all for the sake of her mother. She had told herself it was a noble sacrifice. But tonight felt different. Eleanor's words, Julian's smirk, Richard's dismissive glare. They hadn't just humiliated a waitress. They had insulted the memory of her mother, the sacrifices she had made, and the quiet dignity with which she had raised Alara. A slow-burning fire started in her belly. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, pure, unadulterated anger. The mask of the deferential waitress was beginning to crack. Back in the ballroom, the incident was smoothed over with the seamless efficiency of the wealthy. A new tablecloth was whisked into place. Eleanor was placated with profuse apologies and the promise of compensation, and the jazz trio on the small stage at the far end of the room was instructed to play something a little more upbeat to dissipate the lingering tension. The Blackwoods, having asserted their dominance, returned to charming their guests. The machine of the evening churned on. Richard Blackwood refocused his attention on Mr. Lee, his voice, once again, a smooth balm of corporate diplomacy. "My apologies for that unfortunate display, Sang-jun. A minor domestic disturbance. Now, as we were discussing the third quarter projections." But Mr. Lee, a man who had built his empire from the ground up in the hyper-competitive tech world of Seoul, was a keen observer of character. He had seen the entire exchange. He had noted Julian's smirk and Eleanor's disproportionate rage. He had also seen the quiet, shattered dignity on the waitress's face as she was led away. He nodded politely at Richard, but a small, almost imperceptible seed of doubt had been planted. In his culture, respect for elders, for employees, for oneself was paramount. The Blackwoods' display had been anything but respectful. Meanwhile, in the staff corridor, Alara splashed cold water on her face, trying to quell the tremor in her hands. Mr. Davies found her leaning against the cool tiles, her eyes closed. "They want you to take over bar duty for the rest of an evening," he said gently. "Keep you out of their line of sight. I'm sorry, Alara. If I could fire them from my restaurant, I would." "It's not your fault, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice steadier, now laced with a new, hard resolve. She opened her eyes, and he was taken aback by the intensity in them. The usual soft acquiescence was gone, replaced by something fiery and determined. "Are you all right?" he asked, a genuine concern in his tone. Ilara nodded slowly. I think I'm done being invisible." Before Mr. Davies could ask what she meant, she straightened her uniform, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and walked back towards the ballroom, not to the bar, but to a service station near the main entrance, where she could observe the blackwood table from a distance. She watched them no longer as a servant, but as an analyst. She saw Eleanor preening and laughing, her hand resting possessively on Richard's arm. She saw Julian leaning over to whisper something in Isabella's ear, causing the younger woman to flinch almost invisibly. And she watched Richard. He was the picture of success, a man at the absolute pinnacle of his world. He commanded the room with an effortless gravity. A memory hazy and distant surfaced in Ilara's mind, a story her mother Maria would tell her on nights when her illness made her mind wander back in time. "He had the most wonderful hands, my love," Maria would whisper, her own hands, gnarled and weak. "Strong but gentle. He could make a guitar sing. He wrote me a song, you know. He called it The Willow's Lament. He said I was like a willow tree, graceful and bending but never breaking. He called himself Rick, said his full name was too stuffy for a musician." Ilara's hand instinctively went to her locket. Rick, a struggling musician. Could it be? The thought was so outlandish, so wildly improbable that she almost dismissed it. Richard Blackwood, the titan of finance, a wandering musician with a guitar, it was impossible, a cruel coincidence of a name. But as she continued to watch him, she noticed something. When he thought no one was looking, when his wife was engaged in conversation, and his son was focused on his fiancée, Richard's mask would slip. Just for a second. A profound weariness would settle over his features, a deep-seated sadness in his eyes that mirrored the look she saw so often in Isabella's, and his fingers resting on the table would tap out silent, complex rhythms on the linen, like a guitarist idly fretting a tune. The jazz trio finished their set, and a polite smattering of applause filled the room. During the brief interlude, Julian decided he needed more sport. He caught Ilara's eye from across the room and beckoned her over with a smug, imperious flick of his fingers. Her stomach clenched. She didn't want to go, but defying a direct summons would mean immediate termination. Taking a deep breath, she walked back into the lion's den. "Yes, sir," she asked, her voice devoid of the warmth it had held before. Julian leaned in, conspiratorially, his voice a low drawl meant for the whole table to hear. "We were just having a debate. My mother believes that people in your profession have no ambition. I, on the other hand, think you must have dreams. Tell me," he said, his eyes glittering with malice, "what does a girl like you dream about at night? A slightly less stained uniform, a bigger tip jar." The table chuckled, except for Isabella, who looked down at her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped her clutch. Mr. Lee, from his vantage point, watched the exchange with a stony expression. The question hung in the air thick with condescension. This was the final straw. The mockery of her job was one thing, but the sneering dismissal of her humanity, of her right to have dreams, ignited the fire in her soul into a raging inferno. She looked not at Julian, but directly at Richard Blackwood, whose gaze had now settled on her, a flicker of irritation in his eyes at this renewed disturbance. Ilara's voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, cutting through the low hum of the room. "I dream of a time when a person's worth wasn't measured by the cost of their suit, Mr. Blackwood." Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. "Why, you insolent little—" "And I dream," Ilara continued, her voice rising slightly, her eyes still locked on the family patriarch, of music. I dream of stages and concert halls and songs that tell the truth." Eleanor scoffed. "Oh, a songbird in a cage. How quaint. Can you even carry a tune, or is that just another one of your clumsy pursuits?" That was it. The challenge had been laid down, an idea wild and terrifying and absolutely brilliant exploded in Ilara's mind. It was insane. It would get her fired. It might get her blacklisted from every service job in the city. But at that moment, she didn't care. Dignity, she realized, was a currency far more valuable than a paycheck. She gave them a small, enigmatic smile. "I can carry a tune," she said softly. And with that, she turned her back on the most powerful family in the city and began to walk towards the stage. The entire table stared after her, stunned into silence. Mr. Davies, seeing her determined stride, felt a jolt of panic. "Ilara, what are you doing?" he hissed as she passed him. She didn't answer. Her focus was singular. The jazz trio had left their instruments, and a single gleaming microphone stood unattended at the center of the stage, a silent sentinel. Heads turned as she walked. A murmur rippled through the ballroom. A waitress was walking onto the stage. Was this part of the entertainment? A planned bit of comedy? Julian started to laugh, a harsh, braying sound. "What is this? Is she going to juggle for us now?" Eleanor looked mortified. "Richard, this is a fiasco. Your merger is on the line, and the help is having a psychotic break." But Richard Blackwood wasn't listening. He was watching Ilara, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. There was something in the way she carried herself, a defiant grace under pressure that pricked at a long-buried memory. Ilara reached the stage and stepped up. The polished wood felt solid beneath her sensible black shoes. She took the microphone from its stand, the cool metal, a conduit of power in her hand. The room was now completely silent. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on her. The lone waitress, the clumsy, incompetent girl. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and pictured her mother's face. She thought of the story of the Willow's Lament. She thought of the man named Rick. And she looked out past the sea of confused and hostile faces, her eyes finding Richard Blackwood once more. And then she began to sing. The journey from the edge of the ballroom to the small elevated stage was the longest walk of Ilara Vance's life. Each step was a declaration of war against the life of quiet servitude she had forced herself to endure. The air, once merely thick with perfume and privilege, now felt charged with a volatile electric current. She could feel the stares of 200 people on her back, a physical weight of judgment and disbelief. The whispers followed her like the rustling of dry leaves, a sound of mockery and confusion. "Is she drunk, a woman in emeralds?" murmured from a nearby table. "What on earth is Davies thinking, letting the staff run wild?" a man grumbled, gesturing with his cigar. From the main table, Julian's voice cut through the noise, laced with a smug, theatrical amusement. Well, this ought to be good. Perhaps a dramatic poetry reading about the tragedy of spilled champagne. He laughed, a harsh, braying sound that encouraged a few sycophantic chuckles around him. Eleanor was beyond amusement. She was a marble statue of fury, her face pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. "Richard, do something," she seethed through clenched teeth, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "This is an abomination. The Lees are watching. Our entire future is watching this farce." But Richard Blackwood didn't respond. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was watching the waitress. Something about her defiant posture, the straight line of her back as she marched toward the stage, sent an unsettling prickle down his spine. It was a flicker of something familiar, a ghost from a life he had taken meticulous care to bury under decades of tailored suits and ruthless transactions. Elara didn't hear them. Or if she did, the sounds were distant, filtered through the roaring in her own ears. Her world had narrowed to a single path, a straight line to the gleaming silver microphone, standing alone under the warm glow of the stage lights. It looked less like a piece of audio equipment and more like a scepter waiting to be claimed. The members of the jazz trio, packing up their instruments nearby, stopped and stared, their expressions a mixture of alarm and bewilderment. She reached the stage and ascended the 2 small steps. The polished wood felt like a platform, lifting her above the world that had tried so hard to keep her down. Her sensible flat work shoes made a soft, resolute sound on the boards. She reached out, and her fingers closed around the microphone. The metal was cool and solid in her hand, an anchor in a swirling sea of hostility. She lifted it from its stand. The small click of it disengaging seemed to echo in the now quieter room. The murmuring began to die down, replaced by a tense, expectant hush. This was no longer just a bizarre interruption. It was a confrontation. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of stale wine and anxiety. She closed her eyes for a single, fleeting second. In that darkness, she didn't see the hostile crowd. She saw her mother's face, tired but smiling. She heard her mother's voice, weakened by illness, but still full of love, whispering a story about a man named Rick and a song about a willow tree. He said I was graceful, bendable, but I would never break. Elara opened her eyes. She didn't scan the room. She did not look at the shocked faces or the condescending smirks. Her gaze traveled over the sea of glitter and crystal and found its target. It locked onto Richard Blackwood. And then she sang. There was no introduction, no accompaniment. There was only the cavernous silence of the ballroom, and then a single pure note that emerged from Elara's lips. It was not the breathy, timid sound of an amateur. It was the sound of a classically trained soprano, a note so clear, so powerful, and so full of raw, untamed emotion that it seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. It was a shock to the system, a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning in a dim, predictable world. The guests who had been leaning back in their chairs smirking sat bolt upright. Julian's mouth, which had been open mid-laugh, hung agape. The first few bars were a cappella, a haunting, melancholic melody that felt both ancient and deeply personal. It was a melody of longing, of rain on window panes, of love lost but not forgotten. It was the unmistakable opening of The Willow's Lament. Across the room, Richard Blackwood physically flinched. It was a subtle movement, a mere tightening of his shoulders, but for him, it felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. That melody. He hadn't heard it in over 25 years. But it wasn't just a song he heard. It was a key turning in a locked door in the deepest, most fortified dungeon of his memory. The sound of it, so pure and unexpected, blew the door clean off its hinges. Then the words came sung in a voice that swelled to fill every corner of the vast room, each syllable imbued with a lifetime of another's sorrow. The willow bends beneath the storm, a promise whispered to keep me warm. You said our love was river strong, but rivers wander, and you are gone. The ballroom was gone. In its place, Richard was standing in a cramped fourth-floor walk-up apartment. He could smell the rain on the pavement outside, see the way the cheap muslin curtains fluttered in the draught. He could feel the worn frets of his old acoustic guitar under his fingertips. And he could see her, Maria. Her hair was a dark cascade over her shoulders, and her eyes, the color of the sea after a storm, were full of an unwavering belief in him. In Rick. Not Richard. Rick the musician, the dreamer, the man who was going to write songs that would change the world. He had written this for her one rainy Tuesday as a promise, an oath. As Ilara's voice soared, it pulled him from the warmth of the memory into the cold, sharp pain of its betrayal. And oh, the willow weeps for you, its branches cry for what was true. You traded songs for gold and steel, and left a wound that will not heal. The accusation in the lyrics was a physical blow. This girl's voice was filled with an anguish so profound it was almost terrifying. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. The memory shifted. He was no longer in the apartment. He was in a stuffy wood-panelled office, sitting opposite Eleanor's father, a man who saw him not as an artist, but as a rough diamond to be cut and polished into something profitable. The offer was laid on the table, a position at his firm, a path to unimaginable wealth, and the hand of his daughter Eleanor. The price was simple. He had to leave his old life and Maria behind. He had to trade his songs for gold and steel. And he had done it. His hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, began to tremble violently. The crystal stem slipped through his numb fingers. It didn't shatter on the thick carpet, but landed with a dull, muffled thud, spilling a dark pool of red wine onto the pristine white linen, like a spreading bloodstain. Eleanor, finally tearing her shocked gaze from the stage, saw her husband's state. "Richard, Richard, what is it? Are you ill?" She hissed, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper. Her perfectly ordered world was tilting on its axis. Her husband, her unshakable titan of industry, looked like a man staring at his own ghost. He looked broken. He didn't hear her. He could only hear the song, a verdict being delivered from the lips of a stranger who sang as if she knew every secret of his soul. "But like the willow I remain, and whisper your forgotten name into the rain." Every person in the room was now a prisoner of that voice. They had come for a business announcement, for social climbing, for gossip. They were instead receiving a confession, a raw public airing of a deep and profound grief. They didn't understand the specifics, but they understood the emotion. It was too real, too powerful to be a mere performance. Isabella de la Cruz was weeping. Silent tears streamed down her face, tracing paths through her perfect makeup. The song was a mirror. In Ilara's powerful, defiant stance, Isabella saw the reflection of her own gilded cage. The lyrics about trading truth for treasure felt like her own story being sung aloud. She looked at Julian's stunned, ugly expression, and at Eleanor, whose face was a confused mask of fury and fear. And she knew that Ilara's song was a liberation anthem for her, too. It was giving her a courage she never knew she possessed. Most importantly, Mr. and Mrs. Lee were watching Richard Blackwood. They were astute readers of men. They saw his ashen face, the sweat beading on his brow, the tremor in his powerful hands. They saw a man not in control, but a man completely undone by a ghost from his past. Mr. Lee leaned over to his wife and whispered something in Korean. "His foundation is sand." She nodded, her expression grim and resolute. The Blackwood-Lee merger was dissolving with every heartbreaking note. Near the back wall, hidden in the shadows, Mr. Davies stood with tears welling in his own eyes. He had been Maria's oldest friend. He remembered when she was vibrant and full of life before a broken heart and a lifetime of struggle had stolen her light. He remembered her humming this very melody, a sad, wistful tune she could never quite forget. He was witnessing not just a song, but an act of righteous justice, decades in the making. The final notes of the song hung in the air, shimmering with pain and beauty. Ilara held the last word, rain, her voice, a perfect sustained bell of sound that faded slowly, slowly into an absolute ringing silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound in the entire vast ballroom was the frantic, panicked beating of Richard Blackwood's heart. It was a silence so profound, so heavy, that it felt more significant than any applause. It was the silence of 100 bombshells all detonating at once. Elara lowered the microphone, her chest heaving, her entire body trembling with the sheer, violent release of adrenaline. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, found Richard's again. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. She lifted the microphone back to her lips, her voice no longer singing, but speaking with a quiet, devastating clarity, echoed through the tomb-like room. "That song," she began, her gaze unwavering, "is called The Willow's Lament. It was written a very long time ago." A collective sharp intake of breath went through the room. The silence was cracking. Elara took a half-step forward, her presence on the stage as commanding as any world leader. "It was written for my mother, a woman named Maria Vance." A wave of gasps and frantic whispers crashed through the ballroom. Eleanor's manicured hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning monstrous understanding. "She told me it was written by the man she loved." Elara continued, her voice gaining strength, each word a carefully placed stone, building a bridge to a terrible truth. A struggling musician, a man with a poet's soul and a cheap guitar, a man who disappeared from her life to chase a different kind of dream. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, forcing them all to connect the dots. Then came the final, fatal blow. "A man she called Rick." Elara said, her eyes boring into the patriarch of the Blackwood family, a man who now seemed to be shrinking into his expensive suit. "But I believe you all know him by a different name now." She held the silence for one last, excruciating beat. "Richard Blackwood." The word Blackwood landed with the force of a physical explosion. The silence shattered into a million pieces of chaos. People were on their feet, phones were raised, and a tidal wave of noise, shock, outrage, excitement filled the room. The carefully constructed facade of the Blackwood family had not just been cracked. It had been utterly and irrevocably dynamited in front of the very people they sought to impress. Eleanor let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure animalistic denial. "It's a lie. A vicious, pathetic lie from a nobody looking for a payday." But no one was listening to Eleanor's screeching. Every single person in the room, her son, her guests, the media, her husband's business partners, was looking at Richard. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. His face was a ghastly, grey canvas of guilt. His jaw was slack. His eyes were wide with the sheer terror of a man whose darkest secret, the original sin upon which his entire empire was built, had just been laid bare for the entire world to see. He looked past his furious wife, past his stunned son, and at the girl on the stage, this spectre of his past, made flesh, and he whispered a single word, a name that was both a prayer and a curse, so soft that only those at his table could hear it over the rising din. "Maria." And in that one broken word, the entire room heard his confession. The waitress was telling the truth. Richard Blackwood's whispered confession. Maria was a single fragile stone dropped into a churning sea of chaos. It was swallowed almost instantly by the rising tide of pandemonium. Yet for those who heard it, for Eleanor, for Julian, for Mr. Davies, it was the definitive sound of surrender. It was the truth, stark and undeniable. The ballroom a moment ago, a temple of curated elegance, had devolved into a bedlam of raw human reaction. The air, thick with the scent of lilies, was now pierced by the sharp metallic tang of scandal. A screech of a chair being dragged back, the frantic clicking and flashing of dozens of smartphone cameras creating a disorienting strobe effect. The cacophony of 200 voices, all speaking at once. It was the sound of a dynasty dying in public. The impeccably trained staff of the Serafina Club were frozen, their professional programming short-circuited by the unprecedented social implosion. They stood like statues, trays in hand, unsure of who to obey, their eyes wide with fear and fascination. Eleanor Blackwood, however, was not frozen. She was pure kinetic rage. The initial shock had been burned away by the fires of self-preservation. She lunged at Richard, grabbing the lapels of his exquisitely tailored tuxedo. Her diamonds scraped against the silk. "Richard, tell them," she shrieked, her voice, a ragged, desperate tear in the fabric of the noise. She tried to shake him, to rattle the truth back into its box. "Tell them she's a lying gutter snipe who crawled out from under a rock. You built this. We built this. Don't you dare let this nobody burn it all down." Her words were meant to rally him, but they only highlighted her true fear. Not the betrayal of a long-dead love, but the loss of her station, her power, her name. Richard didn't respond. He simply stared at the empty stage where Ilara had stood, his face a grey, vacant mask. He was a king whose castle had just been revealed to be made of sand, and he was watching the tide come in. Julian, meanwhile, felt as though he were watching the scene from outside his own body. He looked from his mother's hysterical, contorted face to his father's catatonic one. Then his gaze drifted to the stage, to the lone microphone stand that seemed to hum with a residual power. This waitress, this girl he had mocked so casually, had dismantled his entire world with a song. He felt a wave of nausea. His identity, his pride, his very name, it was all predicated on a lie. What was a Blackwood if the name's foundation was a squalid secret of abandonment and deceit? He looked down at his own manicured hands resting on the stained tablecloth. He had his father's hands. He suddenly wondered with a chilling horror if he had his father's weakness too. It was into this vortex of familial collapse that Mr. Lee stepped, bringing with him a chilling, absolute calm. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and precise. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, his posture radiating an authority that completely eclipsed the Blackwood's frantic chaos. He didn't raise his voice yet when he spoke. A pocket of silence seemed to form around him. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice cold and clear as ice water. The reporters, sensing a new, even more significant development, swarmed closer. Mr. Lee ignored them, his piercing gaze fixed solely on the crumbling man at the head of the table. "In my world," he continued, "business is not merely about numbers on a page. It is about trust. It is about honor. We believe that a man who doesn't honor his most sacred personal commitments cannot be trusted to honor his professional ones. A man who abandons his own child for the pursuit of wealth has a flawed character. His foundation is sand." He let the metaphor hang in the air, a devastatingly accurate assessment of the scene. "Our agreement was contingent on a partnership of integrity and mutual respect. I see neither here tonight. What I see is a family consumed by cruelty and built upon a shameful lie." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "We cannot in good conscience merge our company's future with such a volatile and dishonorable legacy. Consider our agreement, and any future association permanently terminated." He then did something that sealed the Blackwood's fate. He turned slightly and addressed the other titans of industry and finance in the room. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. Character is the only currency that never loses its value." With that, he bowed stiffly, a gesture of finality, and turned to his wife. She stood and took his arm without a word, her expression one of utter disdain for the scene around her. The crowd parted for them as they walked their silent, dignified exit, a more powerful condemnation than any shouted insult. It was the sound of billions of dollars walking out the door. It was the first and most important nail in the Blackwood coffin. Their departure was the signal that broke Isabella's trance. She had watched the entire exchange with a heart that was both terrified and soaring. Ilara's courage had ignited a spark in her, and Mr. Lee's powerful denunciation had fanned it into a flame. She stood up her movement, drawing Julian's hollowed-out gaze. "Isabella, don't—" He mumbled a pathetic plea. She didn't answer him. She looked down at the monstrous diamond on her finger. It felt cold and heavy, a beautiful manacle. With a steady hand, she pulled it off. The pale indentation it left on her skin was a mark of her near captivity. She walked the few steps to Julian's side, the sound of her heels on the parquet floor, a crisp, decisive rhythm. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time, he saw not the placid, agreeable woman he was set to marry, but a stranger with an iron will. She sang about trading songs for gold and steel, Isabella said, her voice quiet but strong enough to cut through his daze. "That's what this is, Julian." She placed the ring on the table beside the spreading wine stain. It glittered obscenely amidst the wreckage. It was never about love. It was a transaction, a merger of a lesser house with a greater one. "And I am closing the account." She turned her back on him, on the life he represented, and walked directly to the stage, to the woman who had, in 10 minutes, shown her more about strength than she had learned in her entire life. Their eyes met the heiress and the waitress, two women from opposite ends of the social spectrum, now united on the same side of a moral war. "Thank you," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as she reached Ilara. "You're saving yourself," Ilara replied, her own voice still trembling slightly. Just then, two of the Blackwood's burly private security guards, finally receiving a coherent order from someone, began to push through the crowd towards the stage. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." The first one grunted, reaching for Ilara's arm. But before he could touch her, Mr. Davies moved with a speed that belied his age. He stepped between the guards and the two women, his body a solid, protective barrier. "You will not lay a hand on her, Mr. Davies said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that stunned the guards into hesitation. "This is still my club, and for tonight at least we are siding with human decency over hired muscle. Miss Vance is no longer an employee. She has resigned. Now get off my stage before I have you thrown out for harassing my guests." He gave Ilara and Isabella a firm but gentle push towards the back of the stage. "Come on, girls, the back way. Now." He guided them away from the chaos through a door that led to the sterile, brightly lit service corridors. The cacophony of the ballroom faded behind them, replaced by the hum of ventilation systems and the distant clatter of the kitchens. It was like stepping from a battlefield into a triage tent. The silence was a balm. They emerged from a side exit into the cool, damp night air. The sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a subway, the murmur of traffic felt real and grounding. Isabella took a deep, shuddering breath that turned into a half-sob, half-laugh. "I have nowhere to go," she said, the wild reality of her situation finally hitting her. "My parents will be incandescent with rage. You can stay with me," Ilara offered instantly, without a hint of hesitation. "It's not the Serafina Club, but it's safe, and it's honest." In that moment, under the indifferent glow of a streetlight, a powerful, unlikely alliance was forged. The days that followed were a media deluge. The story was a perfect storm of wealth scandal and underdog triumph. The Serafina song How a Waitress Toppled the Blackwood Titan screamed one headline. Lovechild's lament costs CEO billions, shouted another. A grainy cell phone video of Ilara's performance was played on a constant loop on every news network, her raw, powerful voice becoming an anthem for the voiceless. The stock of Blackwood capital didn't just fall, it nosedived into an unrecoverable death spiral. Richard was forced into a humiliating resignation. Eleanor, shunned from every guest list and charity board, retreated into her palatial home, a prisoner of the very social standing she had worshipped. Julian simply vanished, swallowed by the shame of his family's public disgrace. For Ilara, life transformed. Her tiny apartment was besieged by reporters, but now she had Isabella, who, with the startling efficiency of someone bred for management, became her fierce protector, her press agent, and her friend. The calls weren't just from news outlets. They were from legendary record producers, from concert promoters, from the very stages she had only dared to dream of. The most important call, however, came from a lawyer. A famous philanthropist, a self-made woman who had started with nothing, had been moved to tears by Ilara's story. She had established a perpetual fund to cover every single one of Maria Vance's medical needs, ensuring her transfer to the finest neurological care facility in the country. When Ilara heard the news, she wept not for the victory over the Blackwoods, but for the profound gift of peace for her mother. A month after that night, a single heavy envelope arrived, forwarded from the Serafina Club. It was made of thick, cream-colored stationery, with no return address. The handwriting inside was elegant, but visibly shaky. Ilara, there are no words in the English language sufficient to undo the past. An apology from me is a hollow, insulting sound against the magnitude of a lifetime of cowardice. I once told myself that it was a sign of strength to make the hard choice to choose ambition over love. I see now with a clarity that has cost me everything that it was the ultimate act of weakness. Your mother was the melody of my life. In my fear and greed, I chose silence. I have lived in that silence for 25 years, and it has been a cold, empty prison of my own making. You, with your voice, have brought the music back, even if it is a song that chronicles my own ruin. For the truth of that, I am in a strange and painful way grateful. I have forfeited all that I built. What remains has been placed into a trust. It cannot give you back a father or give your mother back the years I stole from you both. It is a pathetic substitute for a life I should have shared. I ask nothing of you, but I beg you use it for your dreams. Build something beautiful and true. Be the person I was never strong enough to be. I will not trouble you or your mother again. Rick. Tucked inside was not a check, but a legal deed, transferring the lion's share of what was left of the Blackwood fortune to a trust in her name. Ilara read the letter twice, tears blurring the ink. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a reunion. It was a confession, a final, quiet act of surrender. She thought of her mother, whose love story had been vindicated. She thought of the hollowed-out man who signed his name not as the powerful Richard, but as the long-dead Rick. She looked out her small window at the sprawling city. It no longer looked like an adversary. It looked like a promise. The money was an afterthought. The truth, her mother's truth, had been sung, and the world had finally listened. In the end, it wasn't the money or the power that won. It was a voice. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that dignity can't be bought, and truth can't be silenced forever. She walked into that room with nothing but her integrity, and left with everything that truly mattered. The Blackwoods had an empire built on lies, but one song sung from the heart was enough to bring it all down. Her courage didn't just reclaim her own past, it liberated others and proved that even when you feel powerless, your voice is your greatest weapon. If Ilara's story of courage moved you, and you believe in the power of speaking your truth, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more incredible stories where the underdog finds their voice and changes the world. What would you have done in Ilara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.